Tora Bora. The SBS cornered bin Laden, but the Yanks let him walk. The most wanted man, Osama bin Laden, was certain he was going to die. He sat in a cave in the White Mountains of Afghanistan and listened to the world above him disintegrate. The Americans were dropping 15,000-pound bombs and entire ridgelines were collapsing. His men were dying in the dark. On the 14th of December 2001, he sat down and wrote his last will and testament. He instructed his wives not to remarry. He apologized to his children for spending their childhood at war. He was not writing strategy, he was saying goodbye. 2,000 meters away, 12 British SBS commandos were on the ridgelines above him. They had found him. They had fixed his position. They had moved through terrain that would have stopped any other unit alive. They were ready. In Tampa, Florida, General Tommy Franks sat in his headquarters, warm and certain, and decided that 800 Rangers were unnecessary. That decision cost the world 9.5 years. This is the story of what the SBS did right, what Washington did wrong, and what would have happened if the men who found bin Laden had been given what they needed to finish it. Chapter 1. The General in Tampa. "We don't need Rangers. We have aircraft, and we have allies," said the Yankee general. Somewhere above 8,000 feet in the White Mountains of eastern Afghanistan, in the first week of December 2001, a small number of British soldiers were lying in the dark and the cold, watching a mountain die. They were SBS. Special Boat Service. 12 men embedded with Delta Force, moving at night through canyon systems that dropped to -20, establishing observation posts on ridgelines that gave them sight lines across the terrain below. They had been doing this for days. They would do it for days more. And every night, without exception, they were watching something that the air campaign charts in Tampa could not show. The Afghan militia, sealing the eastern approaches to Tora Bora, descending from the mountain as darkness fell, leaving the border with Pakistan unguarded from sunset to sunrise. The SBS noted this on the first night it happened. They filed a report. They noted it on the second night, filed another report. By the fifth night, they were reporting it with the particular directness of men who understand that the gap they are describing is not an inconvenience. It is an exit. A man who knows this mountain, who has spent 20 years memorizing every canyon and pass and track leading east into Pakistan, will use that window. Every single night, the window was open. Their reports went up through British Special Forces channels into the coalition command structure. The message was precise and unambiguous. The perimeter is open every night. The border crossing points are unguarded after dark. We need soldiers at those crossing points. We need them now. In Tampa, Florida, General Tommy Franks was looking at air campaign charts. The charts looked good. The bombs were falling around the clock. The mountain was being dismantled from altitude. The Afghan militia were reporting that Al-Qaeda was still there, still fighting, still had not escaped. From MacDill Air Force Base, approximately 10,000 kilometers from the ridgelines where the SBS were lying in the dark, filing reports that nobody in Tampa was acting on, it looked like the operation was proceeding according to plan. This was the foundational problem at Tora Bora. Not a failure of intelligence, not a failure of capability. A failure of the distance between what the charts showed in Tampa and what the men on the mountain were seeing with their own eyes, and a command culture that trusted the charts over the men. Franks was not, by the metrics of American military culture, a negligent commander. He had commanded at every level, served in Vietnam, risen through the Army's most competitive promotion boards, and been selected by Rumsfeld to lead the most technologically sophisticated military campaign in history. The opening weeks of Operation Enduring Freedom had been a genuine success. The Taliban had collapsed faster than analysts predicted. Kabul had fallen. Al-Qaeda was in retreat. The light footprint doctrine looked validated from every briefing slide available. What Franks understood very well was air power, logistics, and the management of a coalition of 40 nations. What he did not understand, because his career had been built around conventional force and the assumption that sufficient technology trumped terrain, was the specific and irreducible problem that 12 SBS soldiers were watching develop every night from their ridgelines above Tora Bora. CIA officer Gary Berntsen had been on the ground in Afghanistan since before the war began. In early December, his intelligence was pointing at one location with a consistency that removed all ambiguity. Bin Laden was at Tora Bora. The CIA had communications intercepts, human intelligence from multiple independent sources, and the observable movement of al-Qaeda's senior leadership converging on the complex. The intelligence picture was, in Berntsen's assessment, as solid as anything he had seen in 20 years. He sent his request to Langley on the 6th of December. 800 Army Rangers, not advisors, not air assets. 800 soldiers physically present at the mountain passes and border crossing points that bin Laden would use if the encirclement was not sealed on the ground. Berntsen had reached the same conclusion the SBS had reached from their ridgelines. The militia went home at night. The border was open from sunset to sunrise. And without Western soldiers at those crossing points, the net had a hole in it large enough to walk through. General Franks received the request and declined it. His reasoning was rooted in the doctrine Rumsfeld had established as the governing principle of the campaign: a light footprint, local allies doing the fighting, guided by special forces and supported by air power. He told his staff the Rangers were unnecessary, that the Afghan militia properly supported from the air could seal the mountain, that the combination of continuous bombing and local ground forces was sufficient. General James Mattis, commanding 1,200 Marines at Kandahar, disagreed. He asked Franks for permission to reposition his force to seal the border from the south. His request was denied. 1,000 soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division sat at Bagram Air Base, an hour's flight from Tora Bora. They were not deployed. In Tampa, the chart still looked good. On the ridgelines above Tora Bora, the SBS watched the militia go home for another night and filed another report that the border was open. Chapter 2. The man who kept saying, "Send the Rangers." I am telling you he is there. I am telling you what we need. The answer keeps being no. Gary Berntsen was not a man who made requests lightly or repeated them without reason. He had been on the ground in Afghanistan since before September 11th, running intelligence operations that had given the CIA its earliest and clearest picture of al-Qaeda's infrastructure in the country. When the war began, he had moved with the Northern Alliance, been present at the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif, managed assets across 3 provinces simultaneously. He was not someone who panicked. He was not someone who exaggerated the intelligence picture to get resources. When he said the intelligence was solid, it was solid. After Franks declined his Ranger request, Berntsen did not accept the decision quietly. He went back through every channel available to him. He sent updated intelligence assessments, making the case again, in different terms, from different angles. He was not insubordinate. He was persistent, in the way that a man is persistent when he believes the decision above him is going to cost lives and the cost is still avoidable. The answer kept being no, and here is what made that answer so operationally indefensible. Berntsen was not the only voice saying it. On the mountain, independently, through an entirely separate reporting chain, the SBS were sending the same message. Their reports carried the specific operational detail that only comes from men who are physically present. Not intelligence assessments from Langley, not targeting data from aircraft. Eyewitness accounts from trained observers who had been lying on those ridgelines in -20 temperatures night after night, watching the militia leave, watching the passes go dark, watching the window open that the most wanted man in the world was going to use. The SBS reports described the militia's nightly departure with the clinical precision their training demanded. The eastern approach routes are unguarded from approximately 1,800 hours. The border crossing points show no coalition or militia presence between dusk and dawn. Al-Qaeda movement on the mountain continues after dark. Recommend immediate deployment of blocking forces to the Pakistani border crossing points. 2 independent sources, CIA on the ground and SBS on the ridgelines. Same assessment, same request, same answer from Tampa. Berntsen later wrote about this period in his memoir Jawbreaker, with the controlled frustration of a man who understood that being right was not the same as being heard. He described watching an operation fail in slow motion, from a position where he had both the intelligence to know it was failing and the professional standing to say so, and finding that the institutional momentum of the command structure above him was more powerful than the ground truth he was reporting. What was happening in Tampa was not malicious. It was something in some ways more dangerous. A command culture that had achieved genuine success with a particular doctrine, and had concluded from that success that the doctrine was universally applicable. Rumsfeld's light footprint had toppled the Taliban in weeks. The model felt proven. Deploying 800 Rangers felt, from Tampa, like an unnecessary reversion to the old way of doing things at precisely the moment the new way appeared to be working. What Tampa could not see, because Tampa was 10,000 kilometers away and the SBS reports were being processed as information rather than acted on as urgent operational warnings, was that the new way was working against a different problem. The Taliban were a government and an army spread across a country. Light footprint, plus air power, plus local allies was the right instrument for toppling them. Tora Bora was one man in a fixed location with memorized escape routes and a militia that went home at night. It required a sealed perimeter. It required soldiers at the crossing points. It required exactly what Berntsen and the SBS were both requesting. The answer from Tampa remained unchanged, and every night, the window stayed open. Chapter 3. The SBs on the ridgeline. The 12 SBS commandos who deployed to Tora Bora arrived as part of the initial British Special Forces deployment to Afghanistan in November 2001. They were integrated into Task Force Sword, the Black Special Operations Unit under direct JSOC command, whose sole purpose was the pursuit of al-Qaeda and Taliban senior leadership. Understanding what those 12 men were requires understanding what the SBS is, because the SBS is not a unit that explains itself publicly, and the popular understanding of British Special Forces tends to default to the SAS. The Special Boat Service had been built over 6 decades of continuous operational experience around a specific set of qualities that were different in character from the assault-oriented culture of the SAS. Where the SAS were the regiment of the door-kicking assault, of Operation Nimrod and the Iranian embassy and the controlled violence of a counter-terrorism takedown, the SBS had developed something complementary, and in certain environments more valuable: patience, the capacity for sustained covert presence in conditions that defeated other units. An exceptional ability to move through difficult terrain without being detected, to observe without being observed, to gather intelligence with the precision that comes from staying in position long after the discomfort of staying becomes the primary operational challenge. Selection for the SBS was, if anything, more demanding than SAS selection in the specific qualities it sought. The physical standard was comparable. The additional requirement was an aptitude for maritime and amphibious operations, for the particular kind of self-sufficiency that operating from water or across complex coastal terrain demanded. The men who passed were not the loudest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who could function alone, in cold and darkness and silence, for as long as the mission required, without external motivation, and without the comfort of knowing when it would end. In the White Mountains of Afghanistan in December 2001, those qualities were exactly what the mission required. The SBS moved at night, in temperatures that dropped past -20, through canyon systems and ridgelines that the Afghan militia refused to approach after dark. They established observation posts on the high ground above al-Qaeda's positions, lying motionless for hours in rock and ice, feeding targeting data continuously to the aircraft overhead. They called in airstrikes with the discipline of men who understood that a strike called in incorrectly in that terrain did not just miss the target, it killed the wrong people. In an environment where Delta Force operators were moving through the same canyon systems, 200 meters away in the dark, precision was not a preference. It was the difference between the mission continuing and the mission ending catastrophically. They stayed when the Afghan militia went home. Night after night, as the temperature dropped and the militia descended to warmth and food and the rhythms of Ramadan, the SBS held their positions. They were cold in a way that most people never experience, not the cold of a winter morning or an inadequately heated room, but the sustained, bone-deep cold of a man lying still in a mountain wind at altitude for hours, with no shelter available and no possibility of movement that would compromise the position. They stayed anyway. They watched. They reported. Their reports, going up through British Special Forces channels and into the coalition command structure, told the same story that Berntsen was telling from the CIA side. The militia are unreliable after dark. The border is open every night. We need more soldiers at the crossing points. The encirclement is not complete. From Tampa, the response was the same response Berntsen was receiving. Noted. Insufficient to change the operational plan. Continue current tasking. Chapter 4. 2,000 meters. He is on the radio. He is right there. And the answer is wait. On the 10th of December 2001, Dalton Fury had bin Laden's voice in his ear. Fury was the Delta Force squadron commander on the ground at Tora Bora, writing under a pseudonym to protect his identity and the operational details of the mission. He was not a man given to exaggeration or dramatic reconstruction. His account of the battle, published years later, carries the particular precision of an operator who has spent a career measuring things exactly because inexact measurement gets people killed. Days earlier, his team had recovered a radio receiver from the body of a dead al-Qaeda fighter, giving them direct access to al-Qaeda's communications network on the mountain. They had been working it systematically, building a picture of the command structure, triangulating positions, tracking the movement of fighters between tunnel complexes. And on the 10th of December, the receiver locked onto a transmission that was unmistakable. The voice was bin Laden's. His fighters called him the Sheikh. He was exhausted. He was speaking from a position that Fury's equipment triangulated at 2,000 meters from where the Delta team was standing. He was, by every indicator available to an operator, trained to assess these things under pressure, physically present and identifiable at a confirmed location. The SBS were on the ridgelines above that location. Delta were in the canyon below. The target was fixed. The distance was closable. The conditions were as good as they were going to get. Fury requested support. He requested the resources and the authorization to push forward, to cover 2,000 meters of mountain terrain, to close the net that had been tightening for 2 weeks around the most wanted man in the world. The answer from higher command was to wait. Read that again. Bin Laden was on a radio 2,000 meters away. The SBS were in position on the high ground. Delta were in the canyon. And the answer from a headquarters that was not on the mountain, that had not been on the mountain, that was managing this battle from a base in Tampa, Florida, was to wait. Fury later described this moment with the restrained precision of someone who has replayed it thousands of times and still cannot fully account for it. He was careful about where the responsibility lay. Not with the operators, not with the SBS, not with any decision made by the men who were physically present in those mountains. The failure belonged to the command structure above them, to a chain of decision-making that had been prioritizing doctrine over ground truth since the first day Berntsen sent his ranger request and was refused. Consider what was available at that moment on the 10th of December. The SBS on the ridgelines had established observation posts with sight lines across the canyon systems below. They had been in position for 10 days. They knew the terrain. They knew al-Qaeda's patterns of movement. They had the high ground and the training and the professional capability to maintain it indefinitely. Delta Force under Fury were in the canyon with confirmed signals, intelligence on the target's location. The aircraft overhead were on station, armed and waiting for coordinates. Every element of a successful operation was in place except one: the decision from above that said go. That decision required someone in the chain of command to look at the ground truth, at Berntsen's intelligence, at Fury's position, at the SBS reports from the ridgelines, and conclude that the moment was real, the opportunity was now, and that the doctrine of minimum footprint needed to yield to the reality of what the men on the ground were telling him. The decision did not come. Higher command assessed the situation from Tampa. The situation in Tampa was that the doctrine said the militia should be sufficient and the air campaign was continuing, and there was no reason to believe the operation was at a decisive inflection point that required an immediate and irreversible commitment. The situation on the mountain was that bin Laden was on a radio 2,000 meters away saying goodbye. The SBS held their positions. The temperature continued to drop. The night passed. Bin Laden's voice went quiet on the radio. Chapter 5. The ceasefire. 12 hours, the border open, and a warlord who may have been paid to look the other way. On the 12th of December, the Afghan militia stopped fighting altogether. Haji Zaman Gamsharik, the commander of one of the 2 main militia contingents at Tora Bora, announced a ceasefire. He transmitted on open radio frequencies to al-Qaeda fighters in the mountains, telling them he was negotiating their surrender, that the killing could stop. He informed American officers that al-Qaeda was ready to give up. He asked for the bombing to pause. The ceasefire lasted 12 hours. The analytical question that any competent intelligence officer would ask immediately is why a militia commander being paid by the CIA to help capture the most wanted man in the world would unilaterally announce a ceasefire without consulting the Americans he was supposedly working with. Berntsen's answer, in his memoir, is delivered without diplomatic softening. He believed Gamsharik had been paid by al-Qaeda to create the window. He could not prove it. He did not need to prove it to understand what was happening. Gamsharik was not the only problem. The other principal militia commander, Hazrat Ali, had a history of switching loyalties based on which arrangement suited him at any given moment. He had been fighting the Taliban not out of ideological commitment but because the Americans were paying him and the Americans had air power. His commitment to the specific objective of catching bin Laden was, at best, uncertain. This is where Frank's decision to rely on the militia as the primary instrument of the operation is most directly culpable. The British military has a well-established principle about the use of local proxies in operations of this sensitivity, developed through decades of experience in environments from Oman to Northern Ireland, where exactly this problem arises. The principle is straightforward. Local proxies can multiply your force, but they cannot be the decisive element of an operation where the objective is too important to risk on uncertain loyalty. You keep the decisive action in the hands of people whose commitment to the mission is beyond question. You do not make the most important operation of the war dependent on the nocturnal reliability of warlords with competing interests. Franks had inverted this principle entirely. The Afghan militia were the main effort. The SBS and Delta Force were the support. And when the militia made the calculations that militia commanders have always made in that part of the world, the main effort dissolved in 12 hours of announced ceasefire, while the border stayed open in the dark. CENTCOM overruled the ceasefire and resumed the bombing. The hours had passed. On or around the 16th of December 2001, Osama bin Laden and a group of bodyguards walked east out of Tora Bora through routes that had been unguarded every night for 2 weeks. Pakistani forces at the border, for reasons that have never been fully established, did not stop them. He was gone. On the 17th of December, Hazrat Ali declared victory. The battle was over. The SBS left with the Delta Force team on the 19th of December. They had been on those ridgelines for 2 weeks, in conditions that would have broken most soldiers, doing everything that 12 men on a mountain could do. They had done everything right. The man they were hunting walked out through a gap that was not their gap to fill. Chapter 6. The Verdict. Not Fog of War, a choice. In 2009, the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee published a report titled Tora Bora Revisited: How We Failed to Get Bin Laden and Why It Matters Today. Its conclusions were unambiguous. Bin Laden had been at Tora Bora from the 9th to the 14th of December, with what the committee called reasonable certainty. His voice had been intercepted on radio. His location had been confirmed by multiple independent intelligence sources. The operators on the ground had known he was there, had reported it accurately, and had made requests for reinforcement that were operationally sound and were refused. The decision not to commit additional American ground forces was identified as the central failure. The committee found that the Afghan militia had been unreliable in precisely the ways the operators had warned. The escape routes had been open. The ceasefire had provided critical hours. The combined effect of these failures had allowed the most wanted man in the world to walk out of a surrounded position through gaps that did not need to exist. The committee's language about General Franks was careful, but the meaning was clear. The decision had been made from a position of insufficient understanding of the ground reality, in favor of a doctrine that the situation did not support, against the explicit recommendations of the CIA officer and the Special Forces commanders who were present. Berntsen's verdict, in Jawbreaker, was less careful. He had asked for Rangers. He had been refused. He had watched the operation fail in the way that anyone who understood the terrain would have predicted it would fail without those 800 soldiers. He did not write about this with equanimity. Fury's verdict was delivered with the flat precision of an operator who has processed grief by being exact about its cause. His team had been in position. The intelligence had been certain. The SBS had been on the high ground. The request had been made. The answer had been wait. He located the failure precisely where it belonged. The British analysis adds one additional layer that the Senate report, written by American politicians about an American failure, understandably softens. Tora Bora was not a surprise. It was predicted, in operational detail, by the people who were there. Berntsen predicted it. Fury knew it was coming. The SBS report said it clearly. The failure was not the result of bad intelligence or bad planning by the operators. It was the result of a command culture that had decided, before the battle began, that it already knew what the battle required, and that the assessments of the people on the ground were less reliable than the doctrine in the headquarters. That is not fog of war. That is a choice, made deliberately by people with the authority to choose differently, at a moment when the alternative was available and the cost of the wrong choice was still avoidable. The choice was made. The cost was 9.5 years. Chapter 7. What if the SBS had run it? Give us the mountain. Give us the resources. We will give you bin Laden. This is the question that every serious analysis of Tora Bora eventually arrives at. Not what went wrong that is documented, verified, and beyond serious dispute. But what would have happened if the operation had been structured differently? If the men who found bin Laden had been given what they needed to finish it? It is worth being precise about what the SBS actually needed, because it was not complicated, and it was not unreasonable. The SBS doctrine for an operation of this kind, a fixed high-value target in mountain terrain with known escape routes, begins with one non-negotiable requirement. The perimeter must be sealed before the assault begins, not partially sealed, not sealed during daylight by allies who go home at night, sealed continuously, at every crossing point, by soldiers whose commitment to staying is not conditional on the time of day or the observance of a religious calendar. In the SBS model, the Afghan militia would still have a role. They know the terrain, they have local relationships. They can provide intelligence on movement patterns and local geography that Western soldiers cannot gather as quickly. But they are not the sealing force. They are the intelligence layer. The sealing force is British or American soldiers at every border crossing point, every mountain pass, every navigable route east into Pakistan, 24 hours a day from the moment the operation begins. 800 Rangers, as Berntsen requested, would have provided that sealing force with capacity to spare. With the perimeter sealed, the SBS model changes entirely. The nightly withdrawal of the Afghan militia becomes irrelevant because the crossing points are covered by soldiers who do not go home. The ceasefire that Jawbreaker announced on the 12th of December becomes irrelevant because the border is not depending on his fighters to stay closed. Bin Laden, looking east from his cave at the routes he had memorized over 20 years, finds soldiers at every one of them. The SBS on the ridgelines continued doing what they were doing, gathering intelligence, calling in strikes, closing the net from above. But now the net is actually a net. There are no gaps. There is nowhere to go. The timeline changes dramatically. With the perimeter sealed from the 6th of December, the date of Berntsen's Ranger request, bin Laden has no window of escape. The nightly opening that he would have used closes permanently. His options reduced to 3: surrender, die in the mountains, or die in a direct engagement with the special forces closing in from above. The SBS and Delta Force, operating together with the resources the situation required, were capable of the direct engagement. Fury had his team in position on the 10th of December. The SBS were on the ridgelines, 2,000 meters. With Rangers at the border and the net actually closed, the answer to Fury's request would not have been wait. It would have been go. What happens next is speculative, but it is speculative within a narrow range. An SBS and Delta Force assault on a fixed position at 2,000 meters, with fire support from aircraft already on station and no possibility of escape to the east, against a force of perhaps 500 exhausted, demoralized fighters who had been under continuous bombing for 2 weeks, with their leader on a radio saying goodbye to the world. The SBS do not lose that engagement. They have the high ground. They have the air support. They have the intelligence picture. They have the training. And they have something that the 10 days of the actual operation had already demonstrated: the willingness to stay in position in conditions that made staying the hardest thing available. The outcome, in the SBS model with the resources the situation required, is not uncertain. Bin Laden is captured or killed in the mountains of Tora Bora in December 2001. The war on terror does not end. Ideology does not die with a single man, but its organizational center is removed at the moment when Al-Qaeda is most vulnerable, before it has had the opportunity to disperse, reconstitute, and embed itself across Pakistan's tribal belt for a decade. The SBS themselves, asked to assess the operation in this hypothetical, would not describe it as guaranteed. No operation is guaranteed. They would describe it as executable. They would say that the elements required for success were present, that the intelligence was solid, that the positioning was achievable, and that the only variables introducing serious uncertainty were the ones that Washington controlled and declined to resolve in the right direction. There is also the question of what the SBS would have done differently at the operational level, independent of the resource question. The answer is precise and it matters. The SBS would not have trusted the militia commanders with the eastern approaches. Not because of any particular intelligence about Gamsharik's loyalty, but because SBS doctrine does not trust the decisive element of an operation to an asset whose reliability cannot be verified. The SBS would have placed their own teams at the critical border crossing points, supplemented by ranger blocking positions, from the first night of the operation. The nightly opening that the militia's Ramadan observance created would never have existed, because the crossing points would have been held by soldiers who did not go home at sunset. The ceasefire that Gamsharik announced on the 12th of December would have been operationally irrelevant. The border would have been closed by people who were not party to his announcement and who had no reason to honor it. These are not complicated adjustments. They are the standard application of principles that the SBS and British Special Forces more broadly have been applying in comparable operations for decades. Control the decisive ground yourself. Use local allies for intelligence and familiarity with terrain. Do not make the outcome of the operation dependent on the continuous commitment of people whose commitment you cannot guarantee. 800 Rangers at the crossing points, SBS on the ridgelines, Delta in the canyons. The same men who were already there, doing the same things they were already doing, plus the one element that was missing, a sealed perimeter that stayed sealed after dark. That was the entire difference between the operation that happened and the operation that could have happened. 800 soldiers at a set of mountain passes. The cost of not sending them was everything that followed. Chapter 8. The lesson Tampa never learned. Some problems cannot be solved from 10,000 kilometers away. There is a pattern in military history that repeats across conflicts and generations with the reliability of a natural law. A new technology emerges that appears to offer the possibility of winning wars without the cost of putting trained men in dangerous places. The strategic bomber in the Second World War, precision-guided munitions in the Gulf, unmanned aerial vehicles in Afghanistan and Iraq. Each time, serious military thinkers argue that sufficiently precise, sufficiently powerful technology applied from a safe distance can replace the messy, costly, irreplaceable business of human presence on the ground. And each time the argument runs up against the same reality. There are problems in war that require a human being to be present. Not because the technology is inadequate at Tora Bora. The technology was extraordinary. 15,000-pound bombs, satellite imagery updated multiple times daily, signals intelligence monitoring every frequency Al-Qaeda used. The technological resources committed to Tora Bora were, by any historical standard, remarkable. They could not stand in a mountain pass at night and stop a man from walking through it. The SBS understood this. It is the foundational principle of everything the regiment does. You cannot gather the intelligence that wins this kind of operation from altitude. You cannot seal a perimeter from a satellite. You cannot notice that the foot traffic around a farm compound is wrong from 30,000 feet. You cannot hold a ridgeline in -20 for 2 weeks from a base in Tampa. These things require a human being, present, patient, trained to the specific standard that the environment demands. Franks had built his understanding of the war on the assumption that technology and local proxies could substitute for that human presence. The opening weeks of the Afghanistan campaign had seemed to confirm it. The Taliban fell quickly. The doctrine appeared validated. What the opening weeks actually demonstrated was that the doctrine worked against a conventional enemy fighting in the open. It did not work against a single man hiding in a mountain that he knew better than anyone alive, with escape routes memorized over 20 years, with a perimeter that was open every night because the soldiers manning it went home at sunset. General de la Billière, who had commanded British forces in the Gulf War and who understood both the SAS and SBS, as well as any officer alive, watched the Tora Bora operation from the British side with a frustration that he expressed in characteristically measured terms. The principle he had argued for in the Gulf, that special forces were not a cheaper version of conventional force, but a categorically different capability that operated where conventional force could not apply with even greater force at Tora Bora. The SBS were not on those ridgelines because no conventional force was available. They were there because no conventional force could have done what they were doing. The question was never whether the SBS were sufficient. They were more than sufficient for the role they were given. The question was whether the role they were given was sufficient for the objective. It was not. And the reason it was not had nothing to do with the SBS. The Senate report, published 8 years after the battle, confirmed what the men on the ground had known in real time. Berntsen was right. Fury was right. The SBS reports were right. The assessment from the mountain was more accurate than the assessment from Tampa. And the cost of preferring the assessment from Tampa over the assessment from the mountain was paid not by the men who made that decision, but by the thousands of people who died in the conflicts that bin Laden's survival enabled. Franks retired from the army in 2003. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He wrote a memoir in which he defended the decisions made at Tora Bora. He argued that the intelligence was not conclusive enough to justify a large ground deployment. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, reviewing the same intelligence record, reached the opposite conclusion. Berntsen had been conclusive enough. Fury had been conclusive enough. The SBS signals intercepted from the ridgelines had been conclusive enough. The voice on the radio, 2,000 meters from Delta's position, had been conclusive enough. Not conclusive enough for Tampa. The British military has a phrase for the quality of command judgment that Tora Bora required and did not receive. It is called reading the battle. It means the ability of a commander to understand, from the information available, when the operational situation has reached an inflection point that doctrine and planning cannot account for, and to make the decision that the moment requires rather than the decision that the plan anticipated. De la Billière had it in the Gulf War. Schwarzkopf, to his credit, eventually recognized it in others and acted on what they told him. Franks, at Tora Bora, did not read the battle. He read the briefing. The difference between those two things, in December 2001, was Osama bin Laden walking out of a mountain that the SBS had sealed from above, through a gap at the border that 800 Rangers would have closed, into 9.5 years of survival. The 12 SBS commandos, who came down from those ridgelines on the 19th of December 2001, had done everything that their training, their doctrine, and their extraordinary professional capability could accomplish in the circumstances they were given. They had found the most wanted man in the world. They had held the high ground in conditions that would have defeated any lesser unit. They had called in the strikes, gathered the intelligence, stayed when everyone else went home. They had dared, completely and without reservation. They had dared when the temperature was -20 and the Afghan militia had left and the border was open and the headquarters 10,000 kilometers away kept saying wait. The result was not their failure. It was a choice made above them, by a man who was not there, who had never been there, who trusted a doctrine over the people, who were telling him the doctrine was not enough. Bin Laden wrote his will on the 14th of December. He was saying goodbye. He was certain it was over. He could hear the SBS on the ridgelines above him. He knew what that meant. A man who had spent 20 years in those mountains, who understood exactly what it meant when trained soldiers held the high ground above you in the dark, who had watched the Soviets fail, and knew that what was closing in around him was categorically different from anything that had come before. He was right about what it meant. He was wrong about whether Washington would give the men on those ridgelines what they needed to finish it. The SBS were there. They were ready. Washington wasn't.